Trust Zoom. Is our lecturer for this evening. Louise is a research fellow and heritage research and partnership coordinator for the Centre at the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture at the University of York. She works on medieval and early modern culture and stained glass, and was head of collections at York Minster for 14 years. Her PhD thesis was on post-medieval reception and care of stained glass of York Minster. And she's published on the Minster many articles, and has a book based on her thesis in preparation, with Brill's Art and Material Culture in Medieval and Renaissance Europe series. She's also a specialist advisor to the Liege DAC, serves on the Lichfield Cathedral Fabric Advisory Committee, and chairs Wakefield Cathedral's FAC. So she's wonderfully qualified to talk to us about the Crosby family, who were a family of glaziers and painters in 17th century York. And after which, after the lecture, there'll be a time for questions, which I think will be fielded by Kate Giles, if she's about. So may I leave you with Louise and her Crosby family. Louise, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen and do it from the beginning, she said optimistically. Yes, I'm hoping everybody can see that. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be your speaker this evening. As we were saying just before we got going, the Crosby family have rather fallen out of history, so my aim this evening is to redress that. I was watching a popular archaeology programme some months ago as the presenter held up a grubby fragment of medieval window glass excavated from the trench behind her. She then proceeded to explain that this was an astonishing find, not only because what medieval glass was, and I quote, extremely rare, but the craft of stained glass had been completely lost in England until its rediscovery by the Victorians in the late 19th century. You can imagine my astonishment. Whilst this level of misconception may be extreme and from my point of view worrying, there is still a very widely held view that the skills of staining, that is colouring glass through a reaction in a furnace, and painting of glass died out at the Reformation as the appetite for religious imagery fell away, not re-emerging until the London glazes of the 18th century and the stirrings of the Gothic revival. The impression is at best the glass we have today has simply survived. It's a view that was indeed promoted in York itself by the self-advertisement of one William Peckett, a stained glass artist, as he described himself, of the 18th century, who claimed to have rediscovered lost arts and taught himself by experimentation. Judging by the mechanical failure of some of his early works, he may well have been self-taught in some respects. But what I want to cover in my paper tonight is the hitherto lost story of a remarkable family of glaziers, covering 3 generations, who not only maintained existing windows, but who actually made new stained and painted glass, and continued a craft tradition that was unbroken from their medieval predecessors through the turbulence of the Civil War and into the 18th century. The care and creation of the glass of York Minster had been in the hands of a closely interlinked network of family workshops since the late 15th century. The Petty family had been succeeded by the Thompsons, who had themselves trained in the Petty workshop, and who ran things for nearly a century, from the mid-16th century to 1620. At the turn of the 17th century, the workshop had been led by Robert, the master, his brother Roger, and a thriving apprentice and journeyman network, which included Roger's son, George. It was Robert who rather scathingly referred to some of the work he'd been commissioned to undertake as the botching glass of my title, work he clearly considered to be beneath his skills and quality standards. Although in the late 16th century, the word botching still largely meant repair, there was already the beginnings of a distinct overtone of poor quality, which our own word botched, of course, means today. The dominant role of the Thompsons in the care of Minster glazing might well have been expected to continue, given that the workshop itself did continue with the nephew of the master glazier, Robert Thompson, called George, but their association appears to have ended with the Robert Thompson's death in 1620. Their role at the Minster was filled by another family firm, the Crosbys, topic of my talk tonight, with whom a new working relationship was forged. The evidence for and nature of that relationship challenges the accepted view of a decline in craft skills and practice in this period, and marks the continued growth of evidence for the Minster authorities of valuing their medieval glass. It may also represent evidence of a specialism within a wider network or workshop structure. The fragmentary nature of record survival inevitably means it is not always possible to be precise about when the relationships began or ended. The Minster's fabric accounts for 1511 make no mention of any Crosbys at all. The Thompson workshop and Robert Thompson were still clearly at the helm. But following the death of Thompson in 1620, it appears that the members of that family were either unwilling or, perhaps more interestingly, potentially unable to continue to supply the Minster's needs. Robert Thompson had particular skills with painting and enamelling, which had been utilised in sophisticated repairs to some of the major windows, including the St Cuthbert window, which is currently under repair. And his death may have meant the loss of that facility from the workshop. But it appears from my evidence that such skills had been passed on to an apprentice who then struck out on his own. If the demand for such skills was limited, Roger and George may have opted to focus on the more sustainable and lucrative market for domestic glazing with white glass, and have been content to let the more sporadic and increasingly uncertain world of glass painting fall from their repertoire. This was the opening into which the first recorded members of the Crosby family stepped. In front of you, you can see the register for the Guild of Glaziers, and I've highlighted Marmaduke Crosby, who is the patriarch, as it were, and his two sons, Edward Crosby and George Crosby. The style of this lettering will be relevant later, as you will see. This was the start of a long relationship between the Dean and Chapter and the Crosby family, which was interrupted, but interestingly not ended, by the Civil War and the Commonwealth period. More intriguingly, in the church records for the parishes of York as well, it is as if the Crosbys appear from nowhere. There is no record in any of the city parishes or those immediately surrounding the city for Marmaduke's baptism or marriage, nor that of any of his children. The burial of his wife Maribel does appear in St Michael of Belfry in 1650, and Marmaduke himself is recorded as dying in 1666. So they were of the parish of St Michael of Belfry, then, as might be expected of Minster workmen, but their origins are unknown. The same register records 5 children of Edward Crosby being baptised, but again, not any baptism or marriage. This may be Marmaduke's brother, or it may be, it's a little too early to be his son. The absence of baptism records could be because the Crosbys may have been Roman Catholics, although they don't appear in any of the recusant lists compiled by Aveling. But the absence of marriage records is harder to reconcile. So the Guild of Glaziers statutes is the first real evidence we have of their appearance in the city, and being Catholic was no bar to membership there. As the Minster's records for the period 1612 to 22 don't survive, it's impossible to say exactly when Marmaduke was first employed in his own account, but I suspect it was immediately after the death of Robert Thompson in 1620. His name appears, as you can see here, in the Glaziers Guild Register, and this is from 1627. The preceding list for 1598 has no Crosbys in it at all, but then there is unfortunately, as ever, a gap before the Crosbys emerge. I can't provide any direct documentary evidence that Marmaduke was part of the Thompson workshop or trained by them, but the coincidence of dates between the death of Robert Thompson in 1620 and Marmaduke's appearance in the Guild Register in 1621, a page that precedes this one, makes it extremely likely, I think, that Crosby was one of Thompson's apprentices, possibly the one listed in 1611, and became Guild member and master shortly after Thompson's death, and perhaps had been trained specifically in the skills of glass painting and staining. He became a freeman of the city in 1620, but on his own account, unlike those of his sons, who gained freedom by patrimony. If Marmaduke had been trained by Robert Thompson, he may well have been schooled in his specialist skills and therefore succeeded his former master in the Minster role. If this hypothesis is correct, and I have other Minster evidence that I'll come on to shortly to suggest that, it does suggest that established workshops like the Thompsons were then subdividing into smaller units that concentrated on specific types of work. George and Roger perhaps took on the less demanding but more reliable domestic trade, whilst the Crosby nucleus sprung out on its own to more precarious but higher tariff specialist work. So who was this Marmaduke Crosby? Well, on the 27th of June, 1623, he was paid for 16 days' work in the window aisle towards the palace, the North Nave aisle. This faced the remains of the Archbishop's palace, but more importantly, the newly built home of Sir Arthur Ingram, known as Ingram's Mansion. In the window you can see here, there is a fragmentary and obviously much degraded coat of arms of the Ingram family, with just underneath you can see the date 1623. This was probably painted by Crosby, but whether originally for this window or indeed for Ingram's Mansion is open to some debate. I'll come on to the relationship between the rather irascible Puritan Ingram and the Crosbys later, but it's worth noting here that Marmaduke was already being paid 10p a day, the same rate as Robert Thompson, suggesting that he was already providing a comparable standard of work. He was listed as a master able to employ others, and his apprentices were also paid a good rate, 6p a day, whilst Richard, probably Thurman, a journeyman who was named later, was paid 7p. This clearly demonstrates that Crosby, like the Thompsons before him, was already operating a structured workshop with defined roles and rates. The same roll records a further payment in July to the said Duke for 24 days on the same job, but now there are 2 apprentices. This is important evidence for the hierarchical structure of the workshop, or perhaps even only Marmaduke's department within it, and the health of a craft in contrast with the earlier assessments that have been made about the decline. Marmaduke was able to draw on the resources of a labourer and apprentice, and he was able to command sufficient work to support these craftsmen, perhaps be even part of a larger structure. Maybe with George and Robert Thompson there was still some connection. Guild regulations generally did not permit a master to have more than 1 apprentice at the same stage of training, so Crosby must have been financially able to take on his first apprentice within a very short time of his being made free, and this may also be an indication of his desire to build his capacity and reputation. He's paid again in August to the said Duke for another 30 days' work with 2 apprentices, but this time it's on the Great West window. The reference to him as Duke, presumably an abbreviated form of Marmaduke, is unusual and interesting. Once a person's name had been given in full, the most common shortening thereafter is to their surname only, as indeed happens from 1627 onwards when Marmaduke becomes Crosby. But if Marmaduke had been Thompson's apprentice, who is never actually named in the records, as I contend he was, he may well have been known to the clerk in this junior capacity by his Christian name, or possibly even the nickname, which was initially continued. In later records, the same clerk does use his surname, so this initial familiarity is corrected without any explanation. This does suggest, I think, that there was recognition by the clerk, albeit perhaps belatedly, of a change in Crosby's status from apprentice or journeyman to master, and a concomitant change in the protocol of addressing him. So what was the structure and operation of the workshop? Robert Thompson, his predecessor, had briefly and clearly unwelcomely been described as plumber glazier. The role of glazier, however, did continue to be a distinct craft specified in the Minster accounts, with the leadwork associated with the windows being undertaken by another craftsman separate from the glazier. It's not certain whether the plumbers were always part of the workshops, although the amount of leadwork which glazing repair would require would suggest that at least some sort of regular relationship existed. This is a period in the 1620s when little glass is being purchased, and so we may assume that glass was already being held in stock, and perhaps most of the work was in re-leading. Unfortunately, the records for leading don't distinguish between the glazier's work and lead for roofs and other uses, so it's not always possible to be completely precise about the work being carried out. But it does show, again, that there was a distinct structure, and that separation, again, of glazing from plumbing extended the range of service in what was considered a socially superior craft. Marmaduke's successor to Robert Thompson's position was made even more explicit as the relationship developed. In the latest 1620s, Marmaduke is described as the glazier, and he he was getting a retainer fee of 20 shillings a year, which had also been paid to Robert Thompson in 1587. It appeared that he had therefore negotiated the same status as retained glazier. Unfortunately, in this period, only 3 fabric rolls survive, and it's only the last of these that there is any work on glass as opposed to the payment of Crosby's retainer recorded. This is obviously far too small a sample from which to draw detailed conclusions about pattern of work, but it is noteworthy that this period coincided with a difficult time in the chapter's finances. The rents which had supported expenditure on the fabric remained static throughout the 1620s and 30s, but expenses were sharply rising. The problems caused by the severe winter of 1623 had used up almost all the fabric fund income, and this undoubtedly affected the upkeep of the rest of the building. Nevertheless, in 1639, the maintenance of the glass was still able to command a significant proportion, around 15% of the total expenditure. Marmaduke still had a team under him of his sons, and there was somebody else simply identified as a man. At this stage, Edward, his son, was unnamed in the record, simply being referred to as his son, which supports the earlier hypothesis that as an apprentice, Marmaduke would not necessarily have been named individually when he was apprenticed to Robert Thompson. It does make it a little difficult, given the repetition within the Crosby family of the names George and Edward, to work out whether we're talking about younger brothers or sons. One possibility is that Edward, as elder son, took precedence, and so George, who appeared later, may have been identified purely by his Christian name without any further explanation. This glimpse of apparent familiarity and informality in what are otherwise very precise and somewhat summary annual accounts does suggest a rather close relationship between the Crosby family and the Minster administration. Their longevity of employment at a local family firm, as had been the case with the Thompsons before them, would certainly have contributed to the continuity of the craft. Interestingly, in the 1639 roll, Crosby was also paid 6 shillings for coloured glass, small amounts relating to minor repairs. But in miscellaneous accounts paid amounting to 20 shillings and 11 pence for turbs for the glaziers and lime for the tilers and glaziers, suggests the work went beyond the simple patch repair of pieces of glass. This level of expenditure on turf is consistent with the glaziers fueling a glass kiln for the firing of painting or enamelling. I contend this is further evidence that Marmaduke Crosby had inherited Robert Thompson's specialism, and a feature of his Minster work was that he required good quality glass. So where was Crosby getting his glass on which to practice his painting and enamelling? The supply of glass in England had had a rather checkered history. The 1598 ordinances of the glaziers contained strict injunctions against the use of Burgundy or Burgoyne and S glass, imposing a fine of 1 mark, 3 shillings and 4 pence for each infringement. This prohibition had been intended to support the English glassmaking industry and protect government income derived from the taxation on furnaces. A grant in 1567 of glassmaking patents to Jean Carré of Antwerp and Giacomo Verzolini of Venice to encourage them to set up glassworks in England and bring in continental workers to teach the craft was intended to end the reliance on the import of continental glass. Initially, this had little impact in Yorkshire, as most of the wood-fired furnaces, as they were then, had been set up in the south of the country around the Downland and Weald, and then later into the Midlands. However, the rapid depletion of woodlands to feed these new furnaces led to a proclamation touching glass in 1615, in which the burning of wood for glass furnaces was forbidden and coal was the only alternative. The rights governing the regulation of glass furnaces for glassmaking and the importation of glass had initially been covered by a royal patent granted to the diplomat Sir Edward Zouche, who had estates in Northamptonshire. But it wasn't exclusive, and he was unable to create a monopoly position, mostly due to the nefarious activities of his rival, Sir Robert Mansell, a prominent figure at court and completely unscrupulous MP. This caused ongoing objections to the difference in levies by London glaziers who were facing the continued challenges of cheap imports from the continent. Manoeuvring by Zouche allowed the purchase of the payment from Mansell and gave Mansell a total monopoly of glass production in England. This lasted until 1642, when administering the whole system became unwieldy and the disadvantage of native production led to the withdrawal of taxation. So we must assume that Crosby's glass of 1639 would have come from one of Mansell's producers. The plentiful supply of coal in South Yorkshire made it a seemingly natural area for these new glass furnaces. Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, allowed the establishment of a glass work at Wentworth Woodhouse after lengthy petitioning and bribery by Mansell. Although the venture was short-lived, the furnace did produce some window glass, and given Wentworth's close associations with the Minster, it is just possible that this is where Crosby's glass came from. There are several accounts around this period for minor pieces of work where no locations are given, but the arrangement of the accounts gives a better impression of the nature and timetable of the work being undertaken on the Minster, and some clue as to the pattern, if not the actual focus. For example, Marmaduke Crosby is paid for 8 days, his son is paid for 8 days, then later in the account another 8 days appear, Edward Crosby is paid for 3 days, George for 6 days, and then later on Marmaduke is paid for 22 days, work on the register office, which is now the Minster shop. So the pattern of days was spread throughout the year. These were small but concentrated pieces of work that only occupied Marmaduke at any one time. Exceptionally, Marmaduke was paid 2 annual fees in 1639, 20 shillings as the glazier and 40 shillings as the plumber, which means that there must have been more emphasis on a variety of lead work. But it also suggests this was a planned campaign of maintenance and care and not simply remedial work. Crosby's work coincided with the primacy of Archbishop Neale, a supporter of Archbishop Laud and a proponent of the idea of the beauty of holiness, in which the good maintenance of glass played a significant role. Neale's primacy and his influence on chapter resulted in a considerable interest in the appearance and care of the Minster. This was not shared, however, by the city authorities, and the doctrinal divide between cathedral and city became wider and wider in the 1630s. As Professor Clare Cross has put it so succinctly, at a time when the Dean and chapter were making an exceptional effort to beautify the Minster, no single member of the corporation made any gift to that end. All the money for the organ, the textiles, the plate, the glass, came from a £1,000 fine, which the King had granted, King Charles I had granted to the chapter for the purpose of improving the Minster, but the city gave nothing. For the Civil War period, of course, no Dean and chapter fabric accounts survive, and any records created during the Commonwealth were not kept with the Minster's archives. What is clear, however, is that Crosbys were not retained by the city to work at the Minster during this period. Given the state of relations, doctrinal differences between corporation and chapter, I don't think this is particularly surprising. One Edmund Giles was appointed as overseer in 1654 to undertake the repair and care of the fabric of the Minster. Giles was a glazier made freeman by patrimony of his father in 1634 and became an alderman in 1659. One trace of Giles's work, now lost, was captured by the antiquarian James Torr in his 17th century description of the Minster. He said the St. Catherine window in the chapter house, which now contains a date of 1768, recording a repair or restoration by Peckett, he said contained a date of 1658 in gold glass on an azure ground. Despite the chapter house being deemed superfluous to requirements under the Commonwealth and offered for sale and dismantling, Edmund Giles's work was taking care of the glazing beyond that of the most basic requirements of weatherproofing. Torr could provide evidence of this, although, as I say, sadly, it has been lost. It is hardly conceivable the city authorities would have sanctioned expenditure on coloured or painted glass by any external contractor, so the date of 1658 must have been the work of Edmund Giles. Whilst one could hardly claim that a work of a date was a work of artistic brilliance, it does suggest that there was wider skills in artistic glasswork carried on in a small way through this period in York. And it may also answer the long-standing question as who trained Henry Giles, the glass painter employed after the Restoration. The answer may be his father, Edmund Giles. There are no records of Edmund or his father being employed by the Minster before the Civil War, and the decision by the city not to employ the glaziers most familiar with the state of the Minster glazing, the Crosbys, does seem to me to be quite deliberate. Perhaps they were considered to be too closely associated with the membership and work of chapter to be acceptable to those now responsible for the upkeep of the Minster. However, the astute Crosbys had already secured regular work on the principal York estates of Arthur Ingram, who had estates at Temple Newsam and who worked there until 1659. So perhaps they could already see that little new work would be required on the Minster and opted instead to go for a more lucrative and artistically rewarding contract. In the person of Sir Arthur Ingram, however, they were connecting with a Protestant of Puritan tendencies and a man infamous for his parsimony and grasping nature. It looked more akin to a move born of economic necessity than ideologically driven choice or even seeking a particularly good patron. Although the role of Dean and Chapter as patrons had significantly declined in this period, in the sense of commissioning whole new windows, there is evidence the Minster continued to serve as a shop window for the skills of these glass painters and glaziers. This provides an insight into the post-Reformation models of patronage for stained glass and can be demonstrated in relationship by secured by the Crosby workshop and Ingram. Sir Arthur Ingram was, amongst other lucrative appointments, Secretary to the Council of the North from 1612, a position he frankly ruthlessly exploited to amass a considerable personal fortune. He'd built the York mansion known as Ingram's Palace in the ruins of the Bishop's Palace on the north side of the Minster, and he said that he felt it was incumbent upon him to build a house suited to his station in life, although he professed little personal interest in its appearance. Whilst York was still the place to come to find skilled craftsmen of all kinds, Ingram may well have been aware of the Crosbys' work in the Minster, particularly the 1623 work to the aisle windows facing his property. Indeed, it's possible that Ingram had already employed the Crosbys to work on glass for his York mansion. In any event, Marmaduke managed to secure the lucrative Ingram contract for Temple Newsam, perhaps in competition with other glaziers in the city. In 1622, the manor house and estates of Temple Newsam on the outskirts of Leeds had been purchased by Ingram from the Crown following their surrender by the impoverished and bankrupt Duke of Lennox for £12,000. This was the first of several purchases that enabled him to amass an estate of considerable size and value. In the 1630s, he began a programme of radical alteration and rebuilding to transform Temple Newsam into his principal country residence, and it was this work that the Crosbys were employed sporadically from 1537 and in a more concentrated form during the Civil War. The records show that payments to both Marmaduke and later to his grandson, Christopher Crosby. The Crosbys worked there whilst continuing to be paid an annual salary by the Minster and undertaking significant projects after the Restoration and their reinstatement as Minster glaziers. The Ingram contract was probably one of several that the workshop managed in parallel, although it is the only one for which we have records. The first of the Temple Newsam entries from Marmaduke Crosby is August 1637, only 2 years after a major fire had gutted much of the house and significant restoration work was required. The shield that you can see here is in the windows at Temple Newsam and was thought for some time to be the work of the Bohemian glazier Bernard Dinnikoff. However, closer examination has shown that it is not in the style of Dinnikoff, and the date is close to or possibly even after his death. We don't know exactly when Dinnikoff died. He was an extremely accomplished glass painter who'd also worked at Gilling Castle, the home of the Fairfax family, making, amongst other things, the glass sundial that you can see here. Any successor to Dinnikoff would have had to have been a comparable standard, and it's possible that Crosby may have collaborated on some projects with Dinnikoff before the latter's death. Ingram's steward, John Mattison, oversaw all of the Ingram projects, but Ingram's abiding belief, articulated by Upton in his book on Ingram, that all his contractors were out to cheat him, made it unlikely the decision to hire the Crosbys was left to Mattison alone and would probably have been a personal appointment by Ingram. Hello. Although Marmaduke Crosby continued working on Temple Newsam until 1659, the sequence of creation of armorial glass is contemporary with the oversight of Ingram himself. The attribution by Brian Sprakes of a series of armorials and inscriptions to the period 1637 to 1642 strongly suggests that Marmaduke Crosby was hired explicitly as a glass painter as well as a glazier, and his engagement at Temple Newsam was because Ingram had already known his work. It's clear the previous relationship with the Dean and Chapter did not prejudice clients like Ingram against the Crosbys. They were not tainted by association. He was interested in the skills they could offer. Equally, on the restoration of the Dean and Chapter in 1660, the workshop's connections to Ingram, staunch parliamentarian, had not lost them the favour of their former patrons. Sought after skills, it appears, could transcend questions of partisan loyalty. With the restoration in 1660, the Dean and Chapter regained control of the Minster and its finances. The pattern of employment and retention of glaziers was resumed, and the Draft Chapter Act book for 1663 records the involvement of a Mr. Giles in the work on the windows, the same Edmund Giles who'd been appointed to oversee the work in 1654. There is no detail as to what was being paid for, but the evidence from Hildyard's Antiquities of York City identifies the windows in the south transept. There is a window in the Minster over the south door, which the said John Petty glazed, and wherein he is depicted in an alderman's gown. Oh, sorry, this is the, I missed this one, sorry. This is the inscriptions from the dining room at Temple Newsam, particularly if you look at the some of the lettering in the top, and then look at the lettering in the way Marmaduke Crosby writes his name. So I think you'll be able to see the similarity there. There is a window in the Minster over the south door, which the said John Petty glazed, and wherein he is depicted in an alderman's gown. The same window has since been renewed by Edmund Giles Glazier, anno 1662. Despite Edmund Giles' association with the Commonwealth, the Dean and Chapter were willing to retain a good craftsman alongside initially the Crosbys. The Crosby family had been immediately re-employed, but Marmaduke was no longer head of the firm. He was still listed in 1660 as working, but would by this point have been somewhat advanced in years, possibly his late 60s or early 70s, so perhaps was less able to manage the physically demanding job. His son Edward was now named as glazier, and he also employed his younger brother George. Edward had been admitted as a freeman to the guild in 1639, and George had followed suit in 1651. The same pattern of work, occupying both Edmund and George as steadily through the year, also resumed, with the Minster work occupying around 30% of their time. There was enough work obviously available to continue to maintain a structured workshop, and the glass had also been reasonably well maintained during the Commonwealth period. But the chance survival of a small bundle of 3 quarterly accounts or bills shows an apparent discrepancy in the records that amply demonstrates how incomplete our picture of the glazing work, its funding, the extent of its survival, or even flourishing of the craft in this period really is. In 1661, according to the fabric rolls, only Christopher Crosby, Edward's eldest son, was employed in the Minster glazing and undertook 42 days of work. But the survival of these stray quarterly records reveals a quite different picture, including the otherwise unrecorded payment to George Crosby for some coloured glass. It's likely that this was pot metal glass routinely bought by the Crosbys as stock for their workshop. But the main accounts regularly include the phrase his man, including an apprentice, and sometimes a journeyman. Financially, the Minster's relationship, therefore, in the main accounts was with the workshop, not with the individuals on their own account. So the payments recorded the expenditure accordingly. The contents of the additional accounts, in contrast, record the number of days worked by each person and listing any materials purchased, such as glaziers, oil. Totals and notes are written roughly. These were tally sheets to show to the clerk in order to get paid. These vouchers show, in fact, that a total of 621 days were worked by members of the workshop, compared to only the 42 recorded in the main account, a discrepancy which I feel requires some explanation. This reinforces the fact the fabric accounts give us only a very partial picture. And the reason for this is that they are very specific to expenditure from the fabric fund as opposed to other sources. There were other sources for funding for glazing, which included personal patronage, but this was usually more directed to distinct projects such as Memorial Window, and there is no evidence that such a project was underway in this area of the Minster at this time. The alternative sources of not altogether unrestricted funds were the Common Fund, from which canons drew additional income for various duties and expenses, and the rentals recorded in the Chamberlain's accounts. One or other of these must have been used to pay for all these extra days, although in neither instance was this expenditure recorded. In fact, some of the financial recording by the Dean and Chapter in the late 17th century does appear to have been slightly slapdash. The chapter house and its vestibule, areas considered completely superfluous by the Commonwealth authorities, were undoubtedly the area most in need of the symbolic reclamation by the Dean and Chapter and the newly appointed Dean, Richard Marsh, who worked tirelessly, determined to all that the Minster should be exactly as it used to be. In the 1663 visitation by Archbishop Fruin, this slapdash approach came to the fore when he expressed some concern that Chapter, in their enthusiasm, might have misappropriated some of the funds of the cathedral. I fear this project may have been one such example. Although the workshop had survived the Civil War and Commonwealth, it appears that in 1662 it either required re-equipping or expansion, and that such items could reasonably be charged to the accounts of the Dean and Chapter. So we have a parcel of coloured glass for 10 shillings. We have oil for the glazier at 4 and 7pence, 2 hammers, 4 files and a pair of shears, a brush and a large melting pan. But we also have 7 shillings paid to a widow woman for coloured glass. The term parcel is not a standard measurement for glass like case or table, which suggests that it was part of a larger consignment, and the lack of a named supplier, in contrast to the entry for a widow woman, indicates the purchase was from the Crosby workshop. The secondary purchase of coloured glass from a widow is quite intriguing. In this immediately post-Commonwealth period, it's just conceivable, albeit unlikely, that this was an impecunious parliamentarian widow selling coloured glass from her own windows. But it didn't specify old glass, which is a distinction made in previous roles. So it's quite likely that she was the widow of either a glass merchant or glassmaker, continuing her husband's business as was common practice. Although, as I've said, glass manufacture had been fostered in the north of England from the 1630s, there isn't any conclusive evidence that this included the production of coloured window glass at this early date. There is a 1698 probate inventory for one Abigail Pilmay, who was widow of glassmaker George Pilmay of South Yorkshire, which listed blue powder, which suggests this was a cobalt compound used for producing blue glass, but whether for windows or for vessel glass, it's not possible to say. Whilst, as ever, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, if this were a source of glass, it seems unlikely that more details, such as the widow's name or that of the glass house, would not have been supplied. So it's likely that this purchase is either somebody winding down a business or continuing to supply continental glass that had already been imported. The payments for oil in both quarters is the purchase of linseed oil. It's both a component of the waterproof cement necessary for installation of glass and a key ingredient in the manufacture of stable oil-based paints used for glass painting. In the 1598 statutes of the Guild, they specify the use of linseed oil in all work on pain of fine of 1 mark. None of the brethren of the said company or occupation shall from henceforth work or suffer to be wrought in his house by himself, his servants, or his apprentices, any train oil, which I gather is what's train oil is whale blubber oil, delightfully, Sinel oil, or whale oil, which is actually walrus oil, confusingly, nor with any other oil save only with linseed oil being the best quality. The substitution goes on to be both on grounds of quality and cost, and the statute goes on to refer to such use being the summoning of any work to the deceit of the Queen's people. Quality control and the maintenance of standards across practitioners in the city was still important in the continuation of York's reputation as a glazing centre and a centre of excellence. The quantities of oil purchased are not listed, but even allowing for it being quite an expensive commodity, the sums expended indicate that all these things were being bought in some bulk. The purchase of a brush and a large melting pan, possibly for lead, as well as other equipment, do hint at a variety of processes being undertaken. But if it's assumed the oil was principally, if not solely, for the making of cement, then this was still for a substantial programme of work. If it was indeed for glazing cement, then the implication to the introduction of lead mills is somewhat earlier than has currently been thought. The oil may also be for cold painting, despite the impermanence of this being an issue within the craft, and regarding clients as being cheated, as implied in the statute above. The purchase of such materials in such quantity does, however, suggest that there was something more than simple maintenance going on. Although there had been some damage to the chapter house and the vestibule during the Commonwealth, there is no indication that the windows were particularly targeted or indeed had suffered very much. Samuel Gale, the son of the Dean, referred to damage being wrought in the cathedral by the Puritans and specifically mentioned damage to the statue of the Virgin and Child at the entrance to the chapter house, but says nothing, for example, of any damage to the glass. Nevertheless, the restoration of this area of the Minster was symbolic reference to chapter as an affirmation of the reassertion of their control, and so no expense was spared, including on repair work to the glass. There are various accounts and appearances of the Crosbys in the chapter house restoration records for this period. For example, Edward Crosby presented 3 separate bills in the period 1669 to 1670, which included the purchase of a firkin of glass from Newcastle, as well as glass from other sources. The supply and identification of Newcastle glass is one of the few occasions when the source of glass is recorded that does not name a middleman. If the Crosbys were buying their glass direct from the manufacturer, it may suggest the supply chains which had operated before the Civil War and interregnum had not yet been fully re-established, but more improbably that the Crosbys themselves were exercising quality control. That a Hensel glassmaking family had come to England in the 17th century from the Lorraine and established works in Stourbridge and Newcastle, it can be assumed that this glass was from one of their manufacturers. They were known to have particularly high quality control, as opposed to the usual sources, which were not given geographic locators and where the quality was somewhat more unreliable, shall we say. The reference to articles being drawn up in this period is the first direct and specific mention of new separate legal contracts being negotiated for larger projects. Such things appear to have been common in the Middle Ages, such as the Thornton contract of 1405. However, it's clear from work known to have been done, for which no written record survives, that these had actually continued to be standard practice, as hinted at in the 1663 draft Chapter Acts. The chance survival of some 1690 vouchers and a contract give further insight in what must have been these common documents. These provide a rare insight into how such contracts were negotiated and the relative cost of various elements. There isn't time now to go into the details of these contracts, but it does include things such as the paying of the drawing up of the contract itself, the purchase of glass, and the purchase of other materials necessary to the completion of the windows. During the 1570s, 80s and 90s, the Crosbys appear regularly in the accounts of the Minster. This is the contract from 1692. As you can see here, it's a rather damaged paper document, but Charles Crosby, who is Marmaduke's grandson, is listed and named as taking down a certain window, and it's slightly chopped off here, in the chapter house. Charles Crosby had taken over from his father as the named glazier in 1686. His father Edward had made one further appearance in 1693 as a plumber, but thereafter the summary bills are presented in Charles's name. They specify details of the glass at so much per foot, and distinct payments are made for different qualities of glass. It appears from these records that there was a very substantial programme of work going on in the chapter house and chapter house vestibule at this period, and that different thicknesses of glass and qualities of glass had been required in order to complete it. This chance survival of an agreement and a small bundle of works between Charles Crosby of the City of York Glazier and the Dean and Chapter give a glimpse into behind the scenes of how the workshop was operating at this point. The bills account for work on the Chapter House, as I've said, the first of which is headed A Bill for Glass Work done by Charles Crosby, Minster Bill number the 4th, 92. The work actually recorded covers the period 24th of April to 18th of September 1693. So the 4th 92 probably meant they were billing in arrears for work already contracted. The contract named 3 workmen, Charles Crosby, Joseph Burton and Thomas Allinson. The precise nature of the relationship between the 3 men is not listed, although the difference in their pay rates indicates that Charles was very clearly at the head. In addition to the combined labour costs in these accounts, it also contained chance survival of bills for different types and qualities of glass, such as white glass, coloured glass at different amounts and different quantities. Interestingly, it also included 17 feet of painted glass at 6p per foot. When glass was bought in tables, it clearly was coming straight from the manufactory. In contrast, painted glass, costed at so much per foot, was assessed as a craft output, the payment being for the skill, not simply for the product. In that agreement, there is identification of the little window at the west end. This is somewhat problematic, as there are no west windows in the Chapter House itself. The western wall is taken up by the doorway and blind tracery above it. Whilst this could potentially be payment for a minor repair at the west end of the nave, it is more likely, and indeed suggested by O'Connor and Thomas French, that this in fact refers to this window, the Edward the Confessor window from the Chapter House vestibule. The main glass in this is obviously 13th century, but the figure has in fact been very heavily repaired with some inserted glass, and some of this may well be Charles Crosby's work of 1692. The article that I showed, Articles of Association that I showed you in the preceding slide, does lay out the very strict grounds on which the work was to be undertaken. The said window was to be amended and set up and to be fixed, to be well and sufficiently done, and that the notary was to oversee that this had been done before any work should be paid. There is no signature or seal of Charles Crosby on this agreement, which suggests that it was Crosby's own copy, which he inadvertently handed back with the bill for his payment. The agreement was for the restoration of a single window immediately adjoining, following the similar work recently completed, next adjoining southward the little window lately set up. All other windows in the octagonal Chapter House are relationship east or west to each other, not north-south, so we may assume that the account for the high level of expenditure relates very specifically to work in the vestibule and not so much in the Chapter House itself. It is clear from stipulation the quality of work needed to be as good as the window lately new set up, and this was at least the second of such agreements. It was more likely one in a series of such agreements previously entered into that covered the work on the vestibule and the Chapter House itself. It included a payment on satisfaction clause, which is surprisingly similar to the famous Thornton contract of 1405, although sadly Charles Crosby did not stand to benefit from bonus payments offered to Thornton for early completion. The problem of seeing exactly where large quantities of painted glass listed in this bill and the other accounts were accommodated remains unresolved. The restoration of 1845 and extensive intervention by Dean Milner White in the 1950s and 60s have removed much of the evidence of this 17th century work in this area, but it did include the creation and installation of painted elements, and the Crosbys were the family entrusted with this work. The second bill, referring to the setting up of one window anew in the Chapter House, was a new agreement, as the one given above had to be fulfilled by Lady Day in 1692 and continued the programme of repair. But the Chapter House was not the only area of the Minster in need of glazing repair. The bill includes details of work done elsewhere and glass purchased for it: 10 foot of new glass over the clock, 3 new panes on the south side of the east end requiring 25 foot of new glass, 8 tables of glass and 4 foot of painted glass. The reference to payment for painted glass as a lump sum rather than so much a foot suggests that it was in this instance not being undertaken by the workshop direct, and may suggest that glass painting was beginning to be separated out. This total bill for the glazing in this quarter was over £28, a very substantial sum, which reflected the importance of the chapter placed on the Minster getting back into good order aesthetically as well as practically. Painted glass offers no better weather protection than plain glass, so the purchase was evidently an aesthetic judgment. This slide here shows a photograph from 1958, which preceded some of Dean Milner White's interventions in the chapter house vestibule area, and some of these work around here and the lead work may be Crosby's restoration work, although following the earlier pattern and very much continuing the earlier iconographic scheme. The bill presented by Charles Crosby in 1693 has this intriguing reference at the bottom to do with the source of the lead. Memo, there was 3 pigs mark with R used by glaziers this year. The use of lead bearing the king's mark suggests it may have been supplied in the 1630s as part of Charles I's gift to chapter. It's equally possible that it may originally have come from a dissolved religious house, possibly even Revo, as pigs of lead bearing this mark had been excavated on this site, presumably stored ready to transport but never recovered. It's the only entry of this kind in the records for the whole period, despite the extensive amount of lead used, so clearly it was in some way worthy of note. As the provision of all things necessary for the work in the earlier contract was to be at the charge of Mr. Oates on behalf of the chapter, this marked lead was supplied to the glaziers from Central Supplies by Dean and Chapter. This small bundle of papers is a chance survival of what must have been hundreds of such bills and agreements, discarded after the sums have been enrolled in the annual accounts and the work to complete it. The random chance survival of them gives historical usefulness, often lost when special records of exceptional events are retained. The whole programme of work, the chapter house and vestibule, may have been unusual in extent and duration when compared to the earlier entries in works where work is dotted around the Minster, but the nature of the work and episodes covered by these chance survivals are not inherently unusual. One of the mysteries of this period, to finish, is the complete disappearance of the Crosby family from the records of the Minster and indeed of the city after 1703. Their work was apparently supplemented by one James Ward in 1697, who was paid to repair the high north window next to the lantern, although he makes no further appearance. Glass was purchased from a Mr. Thomas Root, and then a Mr. Giles appears in 1700, but no itemised work was listed to which these purchases can be related. The considerable sum was spent across 1701 to 1703, but only a note, Charles Crosby Glazier, paid. This was the last time Charles, or indeed any of the Crosbys, appear in the accounts. Charles may have died, although he was probably only in his 50s, but all the other younger members of the Crosby family also disappear from the records. Importantly, the connection with the workshop's skilled workforce continued, however. The 1704 followed a similarly buoyant trend when Joseph Burton and Thomas Allinson, previously noted as employees and apprentices of Charles Crosby, were paid for work on the Minster. As appears to have happened, the transfer of leadership on Minster projects, which had gone from the Ullman to the Thompsons and from them to the Crosbys, now moved on as they themselves ceased to be involved. So the Crosbys disappear from the historical record as suddenly as they had appeared some 80 plus years earlier, but their importance in preserving the glass, especially the chapter house, and of continuing the craft of glazing and glass painting in York cannot be overestimated. The network of familial and employment affiliation and continuity of craftsmanship between the workshops of the Pettys, John Ullman, the Thompsons and the Crosbys is a vital part of the story of the glass and glass making in York, and demonstrates the active investment not only in the acquisition of new glass, but in sensitive and extensive repair not previously understood. The continuity of employment of a single glazing workshop under the control of a single family, equipped with all the necessary skills, including glass painting and staining, survived not only the fractures of the Reformation and the Civil War relatively unscathed, but changes which had begun to appear in the 1690s began to gather pace at the turn of the 18th century. The Crosbys have largely disappeared from history, overshadowed by the more showy and self-promoting glass painters of ensuing centuries, who sought to separate the art from the craft. But the Crosbys were masters of their craft, not simply botching, but making, painting and refining. Their work survives better at Temple Newsam than it does in the Minster, and more importantly with them and the continuity of their workshop tradition. If it wasn't for the Crosbys, we would not have the Minster glass we have today. And that ludicrous assertion by that TV presenter would sadly be just that little bit closer to being true. Thank you.